hello. Welcome. I will be your professor. This is Cultural Marxism 201. In this class, we will be learning that science is racist. So please turn to page 1 of your readings for this week. As in this lecture, we will be demonstrating that the bell curve does not pass the Bechdel test and is therefore invalid. So we'll start that reading with... Do you hear that? There's something...
Everybody kind of knows he's down. It's just that you don't have the scientific language.
It's facts and logic! Run! Hey everyone, check it out. New apartment, same sack of shit. Now let's get into it. For this video, I'm going to be talking about the IQ test and its usefulness as an analytic tool. And what better framing contrivance to jump into that with than Daddy himself, Jordan Peterson. Peterson has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been a huge proponent of the IQ test, though at times for some honestly baffling reasons.
You can't induct anyone into the armed forces in the US if they have an IQ of less than 83. Okay, so let's just take that apart for a minute because it's a horrifying thing. So the US Armed Forces has been in the forefront of intelligence research since World War I because they were on board early with the idea that, especially during wartime when you're ramping up quickly, that you need to sort people effectively and essentially without prejudice so that you can build up the officer corps so you don't lose the damn war. Okay, so there's real motivation to get it right, because it's a life and death issue. So they used IQ. They did a lot of the early psychometric work on IQ. Okay, so that's the first thing. They're motivated to find an accurate predictor, so they settled on IQ. The second thing was the United States Armed Forces is also really motivated to get people into the armed forces, peacetime or wartime. Wartime, well, for obvious reasons. Peacetime because, well, first of all, you've got to keep the armed forces going. And second, you can use the armed forces during peacetime as a way of taking people out of the underclass and moving them up into the working class or the middle class, right? You can use it as a training mechanism. And so and left and right can agree on that, it's a reasonable way of promoting social mobility. So again, the armed forces, even in peacetime, is very motivated to get as many people in as they possibly can. And it's difficult as well. It's not that easy to recruit people, so you don't want to throw people out if you don't have to.
Wow! The military never discriminates? That's such good news! Someone should really tell trans, gay, black, and Asian people that a voluntary military is incapable of discrimination. So let's talk about the types of questions on these military IQ tests. The US Army would ask recruits things like, what types of products does the Smith & Wesson company make? Or what are the nicknames of American baseball team? These types of questions are obviously biased against anyone who wasn't born in America. It'd be like if a test asked Jordan Peterson supporters how to find a clitoris. It's just not something that's in their knowledge pool. I'm so funny and cool.
Since you're a high school graduate, you won't have to take the psychological test they give to non-grads. But you will be interviewed by a psychiatrist along with all the rest. They've got to know how you'll adjust yourself to the Army. If you've got what it takes to make a soldier.
Are you married, Jones?
No, sir.
Do you like going around with girls?
I didn't before kindergarten, but after that I was crazy about them.
How do you think you'll take the Army?
As well as anyone else, sir.
That's all.
Do I like girls?
For those who couldn't speak English, they had non-verbal tests involving things like showing test takers a picture of a tennis court with no net and asking them to identify what's wrong with the picture. These types of totally unbiased scientific questions led the US military to the totally unbiased scientific conclusion that Alpines and Mediterraneans were genetically inferior to Nordics. And believe it or not, this is actually better than some of the IQ tests that would come later. In the 60s, one edition of the Stanford Binet IQ test that was meant for children literally just had a question that was straight up a picture of a white woman and a picture of a black woman and asked the kid to pick which one's prettier. Now, in fairness, that question is obviously ludicrously archaic by today's standards. More modern IQ tests actually have a fuck, marry, kill option, which does a much better job of measuring both the problem-solving and logic centers of the developing brain. So dumb. But even on modern IQ tests, there's still lots of subtle factors that can bias the results. With IQ tests, things like the test taker's familiarity with the materials can have a big impact on how they score on the test. For example, the conservation test, which involves pouring something from a large, wide container into a smaller, thinner container, and then testing whether the test taker believes that the material, that there's the same amount, or if they're a little baby who thinks that glasses are magic. Literally just all on my floor. One study conducted on rural African kids found that by using nuts instead of marbles for the conservation test, the African kids stopped scoring worse than their European counterparts. It's a lot like how someone might not understand Marx's theories when it's applied to economics, but can understand them when they're applied to helping incels get laid. And so you see, the most important biologist of the modern era was none other than Jacques Derrida. Now, moving forward, we will be doing a postmodern deconstruction of problematic patriarchal symbolism in aerospace engineering. Now, does anyone know anything about planes? There are also a few less obvious and frankly fascinating cognitive biases, like how Western tests generally emphasize solving puzzles in the fewest number of moves or not making any changes to the test-taking materials, things which are very much not universal norms. Most IQ tests also place a lot of weight on vocabulary, something that's more useful for testing your parents' income than your intelligence. One study found that by using an IQ test that eliminated vocabulary and instead focused exclusively on math and logic questions, they greatly reduced the IQ gap between richer suburban kids and poorer inner-city ones. This actually reminds me of a conversation I had with my dad when I first started university. He told me that when I was a baby, he read about a study that said that the more dictionaries in a kid's childhood home, the more likely they are to move on to go into post-secondary education. He then very proudly told me that in my childhood home, we had 7 dictionaries. As if that was what got me into university and not things like the privileges associated with having parents who can afford essentially 7 different copies of the same book that no one actually reads. I remember back when I was a little boy, anytime I needed to know the definition of a word, I would look it up 7 different times in 7 different books. But vocabulary tests are just in general kind of weird, right? Because in general they focus on your knowledge of esoteric and anachronistic words, like esoteric and anachronistic, and not things like knowing multiple languages or dialects. Like, shouldn't being a polyglot count for more than knowing what polyglot means? I don't know, maybe I'm wrong here, but isn't it smarter to learn another language than just to know enough words in your native tongue to sound like a pretentious asshole? I'll also add that I'm pretty skeptical of how supposedly innate things like math and logic really are. I mean, most people aren't just born knowing how to do long division, right? And I'm decent at math, but I also owe a lot of that to things like having good teachers and parents who took time to help me with concepts that I was having trouble with. And had I gone to a shittier school, or had parents who didn't have the time to help me with my homework, or not had 7 dictionaries so I could look up what the word denominator means, I probably wouldn't know that much about math. But there are some solutions to this. The alternative to the Stanford Binet intelligence test is the quote-unquote culturally fair intelligence test, also known as the Raven Matrix intelligence test, which, first of all, they're kind of telling on themselves, right? Like, shouldn't all intelligence tests ideally be culturally fair? Also, Raven Matrix Intelligence Test is an objectively much cooler name, so how smart can these people be if they don't realize that? Anyways, the test is nonverbal and relies on pattern recognition, but interestingly, it's subject to a different kind of bias. Outside of intelligence testing, it's actually used as a pretty reliable way of testing for anxiety disorders, and is therefore slanted against anyone with neurodivergencies. But coming back to Peterson now, the whole military thing is just the tip of the IQ spurg. Okay, because it's IQ, nice. Never mind. With Peterson, it gets so much weirder.
One of the things I have to tell you about IQ research is that if you don't buy IQ research, you might as well throw away all the rest of psychology. And the reason for that is that the psychologists, first of all, who developed intelligence testing were among the early psychologists who instantiated the statistical techniques that all psychologists use to verify and test all of their hypotheses. So you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So, this is a very strange argument that I've been unable to find anyone else making. Essentially, Peterson's saying that since IQ is apparently the cornerstone of quantitative psychology, any criticism made against IQ must therefore be levied against all of psychology. So first of all, this is an extremely Petersonian argument. It's the same type of logic he uses when he comes out against feminism or women in the workplace. After all, Western civilization was built on patriarchal values, so who's to say that if we tear those down, we won't burn the whole thing to the ground, right? Of course, to be fair to the good doctor, he's not saying that. He's just asking questions and not providing his own point of view at all. You know, like a coward would do. But while this argument is novel and enigmatic, it's also stupid as shit. That is just straight gin. Peterson is basically saying that certain ideas are too big to fail. But I don't believe that scientific ideas need ideological bailouts to avoid a crash. As a matter of fact, I'd say that position is so wildly anti-science that it's way more of a threat to Peterson's precious Enlightenment values than any unreadable French philosopher ever could be. In this video, I'm making plenty of criticisms of the methodology of the IQ test without at any point saying that statistics are cancelled. Now, while statistics have been shown to be extremely methodologically useful, a quick skim through their Twitter history from 7 years ago shows that they are, in fact, deeply problematic. Now, moving on, we'll be looking at Eastman Jacobs, inventor of the airfoil. Is anyone here familiar at all with his work? Now, I don't want this video to come off as me, saying that IQ tests are totally useless, because they aren't. If, for instance, you're trying to do something like measure the cognitive development of a homogeneous group of children, then an IQ test is exactly what you would want to do that with. The problem is when you use them to compare different populations, and then you run into the problem where IQ tests tend to confuse difference with deficit. When IQ tests are used within a group, you can get some really interesting results. For example, a study conducted on Indian sugarcane farmers tested their intelligence right before and right after a harvest, i.e. when they had the least money they'd have all year and when they had the most, and found that their IQs went down by around 9 points when they were broke. The researchers concluded that being poor takes up so much of a person's mental energy that their cognitive abilities suffer. And for a real-world example of that, if you like these videos, imagine how much smarter they would be if I didn't have to work 2 jobs to afford rent. And this brings us to everyone's favorite bias in the IQ test: class. Let's return briefly to the eugenicist stepdad of the IQ test, Lewis Terman. In order to show the importance of IQ, Terman sought out children of a wide range of backgrounds with abnormally high IQs and followed their accomplishments throughout their lives. While as kids they were all super impressive, by the time they reached adulthood, very few of them had accomplished much of note. One absolutely savage sociology paper actually showed that if Terman had just gotten a random group of kids, the results would have been almost identical. And when poor old Terman looked back on the kids who did wind up becoming successes to see what they all had in common, well, let's just say that their parents had a lot of dictionaries. Now, as fun as it is to just dunk on eugenics, I don't want to end the video just on that note, you know? I want to be fair. So, to be fair, intelligence is legitimately incredibly difficult to define, let alone quantitatively measure, right? What makes someone intelligent is so context-specific. Generally, the way that researchers deal with this is they'll just say that whatever leads you to become successful must be what intelligence is. But that kind of presupposes a totally fair meritocracy, which I don't want to get political here or anything, but I'm not totally convinced that that's the world that we live in. So that was that. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. First of all, it would not have been possible without music from Will Jarvis, performances by Maya Ben David, and writing by James Elias Island. If you like the video, please give it a like, a comment, a subscribe, hit that bell. And speaking of patrons, I want to give a big thank you to all of mine who help make these videos possible. Balerian, Brett Long, Isso Kuhn, John Price, JP Vari, Shoegazer Boyfriend, Villainous Lion, and Will Jarvis. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. That's the worst way to end the video.